Hey guys, and welcome to British Guy Reacts. It's been too long. I've been busy. I've started a new job, not involving Colombian baking powder this time. I've started a new job, so I've been a bit lazy on the YouTube front, but I'm getting back into it. So I say it's so great to have you as always. Now I've got a really interesting video to react to today. It is when did the US and the UK become friends, which is kind of the focus of my channel. So obviously America was formed as an armed revolt against the UK. I mean, for the first, well, way more than 100 years of the history, it was pretty tense. I mean, there were disputes over the War of 1812. There were continual territorial disputes over Oregon, which led to armed confrontation very briefly. There was an incident involving a pig, which I'm sure we can get into later. There was, during the American Civil War, Britain, or there were some people in Britain who wanted to intervene on the side of the Confederacy. And even after the First World War, even in the 1930s, Britain and America had quite a tense relationship. It wasn't really until kind of 1941 onwards that Britain and America have been pretty much continuous allies. And obviously America is by far Britain's most important ally, and Britain is one of America's most important allies. But I mean, they call it a special relationship, where it's clearly more special to one side than the other. But yeah, so I think this will be a great video to react to. It is by History Matters. As always, I put the original video in the description. I fully encourage you to support this channel, History Matters. Go and get them a subscription. If you want to subscribe to me as well, that's great. But the History Matters is probably more important. So it's 4 minutes long, and it's when did Britain and America stop hating each other? So, without any more rabbiting on, let's play the tape.
It would be an understatement to say that Britain and the USA's relationship got off to a rocky start.
Yes.
In 1812, Britain and America were at war, but just over a century later, they were fighting shoulder to shoulder in World War I.
Right.
Which obviously raises the question, when did Britain and America become allies? There has
Sure,
to be a
I'm
point
with
where
you.
both went from actively disliking each other to working alongside each other.
I love how that guy looks incredibly like Stalin. I'm not quite sure if he's meant to represent... Oh, actually, hang on. That is meant to be Stalin, isn't it? So that's meant to be, what, Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin? I was thinking, what a coincidence, that guy really looks like Stalin. And it actually is meant to be Stalin. So I'm an idiot. Anyway, on that bombshell.
Now, before continuing, it's important to note that even in the immediate...
So for those of you who don't, Vote Leave was the official Brexit campaign in 2016. So I'm not going to say any more on that subject, because this isn't a political channel. But that's the reference there.
Aftermath of independence, America and Britain still had strong economic ties. This isn't to say that things were always...
I mean, the strong economic ties is a very interesting one, because... as we did in a previous video, I did a video on the War of 1812, which somehow I called the War of 2018, and I'm so embarrassed about that. Loads of you pointed out in the comments so much. I'm very grateful. I haven't quite got over that yet, to be honest. I mean, the War of 2018 was horrible as well. There were some really cutting Twitter threads, I heard. But yes, yeah, so the War of 1812, there were parts of America which very much didn't want to go to war with Britain. I mean, we covered this in a previous video. The vote for war was very, very narrow. And a lot of the bits which were anti-war, generally around the northeast, it's because they had very close economic trade ties with Britain. So you can see that even though Britain and America were rivals, they maintained very close commercial ties.
It's great between the two, and there were some pretty major conflicts of interest in the years after the War of 1812 finished. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, was the Monroe Doctrine, established in 1823. This was where the United States, by threat of military intervention, declared an end to any new European colonial adventures in the Americas.
Right.
And for Britain, this was potentially a problem because it had economic interests in South America. In reality, though, it wasn't too much of a problem at all, because in 1833 it landed a force on the Falkland Islands and America did nothing. In 1842, the US...
I mean, obviously, in this one case of the Falklands, it was kind of ignored, but generally the Monroe Doctrine was a big success. I mean, South America was largely spared from the ravages of South America, having become independent, was then largely spared from further European colonialism. I mean, there are some interesting cases. So, like Mexico, for example, got invaded by France, and with the UK doing a bit of a subordinate role. But that was around the time of the American Civil War. So that gives you kind of a glimpse into what the European powers probably would have been doing had it not been for the powerful United States and the Monroe Doctrine. Because during the American Civil War, when America was in chaos, the European powers started to behave in a much more predatory way.
West did warn Britain against interference in Hawaii, which Britain did heed because America's international power was certainly growing. And it was this fact that America was a rapidly growing great power whose interests could no longer be ignored, which would dominate Anglo-American relations for the following century.
Right.
So the next major event which could have changed the Anglo-American dynamic was the American Civil War, which broke out in 1861. Britain had already abolished slavery at this point, and so you would think that it would have preferred the Union over the Confederacy. But you'd be wrong. Now, Britain had no great affection for the Confederacy in its slaveholding practices. Its preferential treatment was purely economic, mostly due to cotton imports.
Yeah.
Britain did consider formally recognising the Confederacy in Anglo-American relations.
I mean, there were some very tense points during the Civil War, as in between Britain and America. And not just between... France was in a similar position to Britain, so there were people within France who were advocating for official recognition of the Confederacy, perhaps even enter the war on the Confederacy side. And obviously, if that had happened, history could be very different. I mean, you imagine that the Confederacy, backed up by Britain and France, probably would have survived, which would be very weird because the United States of America became independent to a significant degree because of French support. So if French support then was involved in breaking up the United States, there would be a kind of a double irony there. But yeah, so I mean, the issue of slavery actually was very useful for. I mean, obviously, slavery is a horrendous, horrific, morally unjustifiable practice, but it was very useful for the banning. It was very useful not just on moral grounds, but also for keeping the British and French out of the war, because Britain and France, by this point, and very much kind of earlier if they had not been, were anti-slavery.
Was severely harmed by what's called the Trent Affair. This was where the US government seized a ship with Confederate diplomats headed for Britain, which to Britain looked like the USA telling it who it could and couldn't speak to. In the end, cooler heads prevailed. It's
kind of interesting that's quite similar to how the War of 1812 started. So during the War of 1812, Britain told America that if you want to trade with you have to trade via British ports. And America said, fuck off. And there was obviously impressment and lots of other issues as well, but that's kind of similar to how, with the Trent Affair, America was saying to Britain that you can't talk to certain countries, and it had much the same reaction. Well, self-declared countries, I suppose we should say.
Prevailed and Britain didn't get involved, although it did construct a very powerful warship, the CSS Alabama, for the Confederacy.
Oh, right.
And after the Civil War was over, Britain paid compensation to the United States. Thus, only 50 years away from World War I, Britain and America still didn't really care much for each other.
Sure.
So what changed this? Well,
I mean, the other thing which this video hasn't touched on is there was a territorial dispute over Oregon. And that went on quite late. I mean, weirdly, the German Kaiser ended up being one of the people who mediated it, and he mediated it on the side of the United States. But there was quite a bit of tension over Oregon, over exactly where the border is. Obviously, that's now the border between the United States and Canada. And there was one incident which came as the War of the Pig, which was a kind of complete farce. I mean, it wasn't a real war; no one was killed. But basically, a British settler shot. No, wrong way around. An American settler shot a pig owned by a British settler. And the situation escalated, but these two guys became really angry at each other and eventually had troops from both sides involved. I mean, there was a peaceful solution, but there was a lot of tension over Oregon and exactly where the border between America and what is now Canada should be.
Relations actually started to improve during Britain's border dispute with Venezuela in 1895. This developed into somewhat of a crisis, and the US intervened and arbitrated, siding mostly with Britain.
Okay.
For Britain, America had conducted itself in a well-mannered fashion and given Britain most of what it had wanted. And for America, by accepting American arbitration, Britain had yielded its right to influence South America. The other reason for Anglo-American rapprochement was simple: converging interests. America had emerged from its Civil War a more centralised industrial power, and after it defeated Spain in 1898, it possessed a global empire too.
Yeah.
And for Britain...
Yeah, so that's actually America's very relatively brief spell as an openly imperialistic power, when it controlled the Philippines and Cuba particularly. I think that's a really interesting point in history, because you can see what America could have gone down the route of being a kind of standard European-style power with a big colonial empire. Following the likes of Britain and France and Spain and so on. And for a couple of decades it looked like it might happen, but it didn't. It crawled back from and it remained broadly an anti-imperialist power. And that played a big role in the deconstruction of European empires after World War II, is the American anti-imperialism. I mean, it was a very selective anti-imperialism. I mean, sometimes they would defend empire when it was in their interest, in particular when it was stopping communism. But generally, the Americans pushed for European empires to be dismantled. And it's kind of an interesting question: what would have happened if America had become a truly imperial power itself? The other point is, I mean, even in the 1930s, there's a lot of tension between Britain and America. So it's always that question. There was a Greek historian called Thucydides, I think he's called, a Greek historian. So he covered the Peloponnesian War between Sparta and Greece, and there's a thing called the trap of Thucydides, which is the theory that when you have one rising power and one declining power, more often than not, they end up fighting each other. And Britain and America escaped that. So America replaced Britain as the world's prominent power between kind of the 1930s, 1940s, without war between the two, which is very interesting. Why did that happen? Why was there no armed conflict between the two? And it's particularly interesting in light of kind of current events where you've got China potentially replacing America as the preeminent world power, and can that happen without armed conflict? So echoes of history and contemporary politics are kind of merging.
Things were rapidly changing as well. Its empire and global position was being threatened by Russia and the newly formed Germany. Britain had long practiced a policy of isolationism with respect to the European powers, but since they too were industrialising, this had the potential to threaten Britain's position. Thus, her most natural ally seemed to be the United States, since it was half a world away and had its own sphere of influence, plus they spoke the same language and shared many values. It was at the turn of the 20th century under President Theodore Roosevelt that America and Britain really started.
So we didn't actually touch on this on my video on Roosevelt, who's such an interesting guy. I watched a kind of biography video on him, and he had the most amazing life you can imagine. Didn't touch on it on the video, but it's very interesting that it was under him that UK-US relationships started to warm.
Started to become friends, particularly with respect to one foreign policy stance. They didn't like Germany. This agreement allowed for Britain to move its fleet away from its Caribbean colonies back to Britain to defend itself from Germany, while security in the Caribbean would fall to the US. After the First World War broke out, Germany's actions, such as U-boat attacks on American shipping and the Zimmermann telegram, combined with the fact that if Britain and France lost the war, they wouldn't be able to pay their American loans back, assured US intervention on their side.
American intervention in World War I is still quite... it's an interesting subject in the sense that America definitely didn't need to go to war, and if Germany hadn't been so provocative, I mean, the Zimmermann telegram which was essentially an attempt to get Mexico to attack America, was just nuts. It was crazy, and unrestricted U-boat warfare was not smart, and Germany didn't need to do it. I mean, had America not entered the war after Russia was knocked out by the Russian Revolution, there's a pretty good chance that Germany would have been able to knock out France and effectively knock out the UK. So it was a huge own goal by the Germans to provoke the Americans, and completely unnecessary. I mean, the kind of what they had gained in military advantage by sinking a few American ships was really pretty low. So
and from that point onwards, both the US and UK were largely in the same camp, barring a couple of mishaps here and there.
Yeah.
I hope you enjoy.
So mishap is an interesting way of putting it. Clearly, there have been a couple of points where American British, since the 1940s, where the US-UK alliance has been tested. So I'm thinking, the US invasion of Grenada was a real sore point of Britain, but the really big one is the Suez Crisis, which is when this was a point where Britain and France still fancied themselves as truly great powers, kind of along the lines of the USA and the USSR. And so when Egypt, led by a guy called Nasser, nationalised the Suez Canal, which had been owned by British and French companies, Britain and France and Israel came up with a conspiracy to invade Egypt. And I mean, it's one of these conspiracies that was kind of almost so clever it was stupid. So the idea was Israel would invade Egypt, and then Britain and France would would give an ultimatum to both sides to stop the fighting and to kind of pull their forces back. And Egypt would naturally have to refuse because this was its land. So then Britain and France would invade. Now, at this point, the USA and the USSR both became furious. They're kind of anti-colonialism. They put huge pressure on the British pound, and Britain and France were forced into an extremely humiliating withdrawal, which is kind of the end of Britain and France as truly first-rate world powers, I think it's fair to say. I mean, from that point on, it was the USA and the USSR, and everything else was at least a tier below. But yeah, so I think
this episode, and thank you.
I think that's the end of the video. So say no, it's a fascinating subject. I mean, Britain and America have been solid allies now for about 70 years or so, but for much of their history, it's a very tense relationship, although still a lot of commercial and cultural exchange. So yeah, I really hope you enjoyed that. I certainly did. So please do give a like, give a comment below on why you think America and Britain became friends. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope to see you for the next video. Thank you.